Then we have to share this.
Ready to go.
So it should be good. See, I knew you knew more than we did.
Well, I felt okay to offer my assistance based on your initial comment.
Before I did.
Okay, that's good. It is a duty of the head also. Directors. Yes, their daughter's grandson has to go up to short put ice as well. Go enjoy it. Oh, just. Yes, lots of.
Yeah.
That's good.
Oh, yeah. Really fortunate.
Afternoon, everybody. I'm David Boris, the president of the Emeritus Center. Welcome everybody here today. Before the talk begins, of course, I'll give you my announcements. We got the Ally program starting up in mid-March. We're getting more and more people signing up, so if you're thinking about it, get in quick. And then, of course, the funds that we have available for Merit faculty who are doing wonderful things, pay for travel, pay for attendance at conferences, whole bunch of things. So take advantage of that. We'd love to give out that money. And I'll turn this over to Scott now. We'll introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Jim.
You're welcome, Scott.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the third program of the spring. Doesn't feel like spring yet.
It's spring. It's sunny.
I watched the ball game yesterday.
Yeah.
Didn't recognize any of the guys, which is, it's spring training. Anyway, we welcome Dr. Melissa Arnold Lynn, or Mimi, an assistant professor of public policy at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at UAlbany. Mimi studies the political economy of educational policy, focusing on labor, governance, and teacher politics and policy. She seeks to answer big questions. How do economic inequities shape the politics of education and education governance? Who governs education? How do educational institutions shape and get shaped by economic incentives and behaviors? I read this a week ago and it didn't mean the same thing as it means today. Her research has been published in so many journals, including Educational Researcher, Journal of Human Resources, American Educational Research Journal, Political Behavior, Education, Finance, and Policy, Policy Studies Journal, Economics of Education Review, and Teachers College Record. Her work has been covered extensively in national and local news media, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, CNN, the Today Show, NPR's Morning Edition, and CBS News. She was quoted recently in USA Today as she looked and talked about how low teacher salaries deter the pursuit of education and existing options for them. Melissa received her PhD from Teachers College, Columbia University, and prior to graduate school, she was in a classroom as a sixth grade teacher in Houston, Texas. So you've been in the fight. Well, anyway, please welcome Mimi Lyon to the Emeritus Center.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. Today I'm presenting on some work that I think some folks had stumbled upon through that USA Today article on the state of the teaching profession, where my co-author, Matthew Kraft, and we trace essentially the status of the teaching profession over the past 50 years and discuss and examine the sort of fluctuations that we observe and what that means for what's happening today. Before I get into the presentation, a little bit about me. As Scott gracefully mentioned in my background, I was a 6th grade teacher before I got my PhD. So I taught in a charter school in Houston. It was a sort of no excuses type charter school. I had an extremely large class size, and I really felt, even just after working in the district for 5 years, just very, very tired. And so I went to graduate school trying to understand some of the sort of socio-political and economic factors that were shaping that. And I went to graduate school in New York City. So I moved from Texas to New York City, and really got interested in trying to think about these variations in teaching and how people think about teaching and how people in society kind of respect or don't the K-12 teaching. So I got my PhD, and I have been an assistant professor here in Rockefeller College downtown for the past 3 years. This year, I'm on a fellowship, so I'm relieved of teaching and service, but still, and very much enjoying that. And then, yeah, so that kind of brings me to here today. A lot of my work right now is on the teaching profession and teachers' unions in particular. And just thinking about labor in relation to teaching is really something I'm interested in these days. So why study the teaching profession? So the teaching profession is important both, I think, for the important and large effects that teachers have on their students. But also, I think it's important to remember that teachers are important in and of themselves. They don't have to only be important because of the effects that they have on their students. We're talking about 4.2 million Americans are K-12 teachers today, largely women. And that's about 6% of the college-educated workforce. So when we're talking about the teaching profession, I think teachers matter because they shape society, they shape student outcomes, they shape civic outcomes, educational outcomes, but also teachers matter in and of themselves. Teachers have their own value. These are real humans that we should care about for their own sakes too. And yet, teachers have for a long time struggled to establish the teaching profession as a profession. So this has been a sort of constant battle in the history of teaching, is trying to figure out where the teaching profession fits. Oftentimes, folks will try to suggest that teachers have the same professional prestige as doctors, or that could happen, that's sort of the off-sided goal. But we're really talking about a workforce of entirely different size, right? So every year, about 200,000 new teachers get hired. And to fill that kind of huge demand, we have to have a huge supply of teachers. And so historically speaking, we've often, some have called teaching a semi-profession, because it's so difficult to sort of create really high professional standards when you need such a huge supply of workers. In general, I think a lot of the literature thinks about this as sort of static in time, and that's something that I don't think fits with how, and static across place, I think too, but that doesn't really fit with reality. And so this is sort of the goal of this project, is to try to understand how that professionalism has changed over time. Some of this was motivated by reporting around 2022 and even a little bit before, where there was a lot of concern, sort of almost seeming like it came out of nowhere, about teacher shortages. And a lot of them were getting attributed to the pandemic, that with this idea that lots of teachers quit or left their jobs in and around the timing of the pandemic, and that those created vacancies that districts have struggled to fill. And So this spurred my co-author and I to really wonder, is this a pandemic thing, or is this something that has actually been building for a long time? Because if this was just a pandemic thing, then we should expect that as we recover from the pandemic and go back to how life, attempt to go back to how life was prior to the pandemic, that things would sort of resolve themselves and that the profession would sort of get better on its own. But if this is something more systemic, something structural that's been building for a long time, then it's probably not going to go back on its own, and probably it's going to create some kind of systemic or structural response. So that's sort of what we're endeavoring to uncover here. And so the first question is trying to look back at the state of the profession over the past half century. So we start in 1970. This feels like a good time to start for a number of reasons. 1965 was sort of a big pivotal point for the state of the profession. A lot of data starts getting collected in 1970, so going earlier than that really would be incredibly tricky. And also that's about the time when the sort of nature and structure of public schooling that we see now was sort of solidified. So high school expansion had pretty much finished. There was huge, vast district consolidations that happened in the earlier, but prior to 1970. Those were a little bit more established around 1970. So we started in 1970 and tried to trace the status of the teaching profession. We think about the status of the profession as like 4 interrelated pieces that you could kind of think about as like the arc of an individual teacher, an individual person considering going into the profession. So first, you just exist in society, right? And so you're here and you just kind of experience what people see and feel and how people talk about teaching. So in a sense, we start with prestige because even as a young student, you might be shaped by whether or not you think on career day that you might want to become a teacher, or on Halloween, are you going to dress up like a firefighter or a teacher, one of these sort of like prestige professions that we think of that way. So first, we're thinking about just like existing in society, being a participant in society, and seeing how an individual kind of experiences that culture and develops an idea about what teaching, how might they be respected if they went into teaching. Then you would have to express an interest in going into teaching. So as a student, so teaching requires degrees, right? So as a student, you would need to, in most places, get at least, well, everywhere get at least a BA, and then in many places get a master's degree in education or in your field with also a certificate in education. So you have to both express an interest in going into teaching, then you have to actually take the coursework and then get that degree and get the license. And so then we go into teacher preparation and we think about degrees and licenses in education. And then finally you become a teacher, and then are you happy? Like, are you satisfied with that choice? Do you stay? Are you do you feel safe in your job? How is the profession sort of treating you? And so, and then that, it's all kind of, these are sort of mutually reinforcing and cyclical. This isn't necessarily like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, but it's sort of a helpful way to kind of compartmentalize these different mutually reinforcing, overlapping ideas that kind of shape the status of the profession. Because satisfaction, how you as a student experience your own teacher satisfaction, might shape the way that you think about teaching and how much you think that you might want to consider pursuing a degree in teaching. So it all kind of like overlaps and cycles. And we're not going to be too concerned about all of that, because essentially the methods in this paper, which I'll show you at the end, is now published in American Educational Research Journal, are essentially eyeball tests. And so what we've done is to bring together 18 different data sources that get at each of these different constructs in different ways over the past 50 years to try to examine the trends over time. And what we see, and why this sort of descriptive paper was still published in the #1 education journal, is that there's these really remarkably consistent trends across measures when you look at trends over time on these different things. Sort of kind of building up this idea that these are all kind of getting at some underlying ideas about the profession. It's not necessarily that prestige causes interest or that interest causes prestige, but that we're looking broadly at these trends over time. So starting with prestige, we rely on two different data sets going back to as far as we can go. And the first one asks a nationally representative sample, and some of this we had to commission ourselves too, about how they think of teaching. So this would be the most direct measure of teacher prestige. This one we don't have going all the way back to 1970, but which we would have liked. But we do have from 1977 to 2022, and the Harris poll does this nationally representative polling. We commissioned the 2022 one. And so we just ask a nationally representative sample, how prestigious do you view teaching, and a few other occupations. So you could also compare against other occupations. And what we see is about 2/3 of respondents in 77 said that they saw teaching as having considerable or great prestige. By 1980, 81, this drops down to 54%, but then recovers. And what you'll see as I continue to show you more figures is that this decline in the 70s, and actually I'll show you some that go all the way back to 1970, then a sort of pivot point early 80s, and recovery in the 80s and 90s is a remarkably consistent trend across 18 different measures of these 4 different constructs: the prestige, interest, preparation, and satisfaction. And then we see a pretty steady, typically pretty like level in the 90s, 2000s, and then across almost every measure we look at, right at 2010, 2009, we see a big drop in the state of the profession. So here you see that again, where the percent of respondents, the percent of the US that sees teaching as prestigious drops dramatically, right around 2010.
So
From-
this is prestige of teachers?
This is
that
just
poll,
teachers,
or
yeah.
all adults.
This
You
is-
say adults there, slide.
Adults are polled. This is who observe teaching as a prestigious career. So the question is
Teachers that are
asking,
polled,
No,
not-
no.
Not adults. Oh, it's
adults are polled, but they're asking, the question is asking about,
just the average citizen on the streets.
yeah, so
Okay,
your national
okay.
representative sample, do you view teaching as a
Okay.
prestigious, or what degree of prestige would you,
Okay.
I can't remember the exact
Okay,
question.
but it's
Yeah.
adults and not teachers.
Adults, yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, we do have, anyway. Yeah, so you see this dramatic drop in 2010, and then a slightly different question, but is getting at the same idea, is PDK polling on parent perceptions of teaching. And this is whether or not they would want their kid to go into teaching. And here you can see essentially the same pattern. We can have data going back even farther, where about 3 out of 4 parents, this is just parents, say they would want their kid to become a teacher.
What's the year? Sorry.
This is 1970. So every figure, no matter when, so sometimes, it's hard to get data, nationally representative samples, all going back into time, but all the figures will start in 1970 and then try to get as far into the future as I possibly can.
So with this rating of prestigious,
Uh-huh.
what's the order of magnitude of the percentages? If you asked adults, say about doctors.
Right,
Or
yeah.
about lawyers, or about firefighters, what would the order of percentage be?
Yeah, and so they are a little bit inconsistent, but they do ask about doctors and lawyers. And I have and I can see if I can find it. I don't have it on this presentation, but we did look at that. They don't always ask, they ask about 5 occupations every year, so they don't always ask about the same ones. So you don't always get teachers being asked about the same year as doctors, if that makes sense. But
I'm wondering like what the maximum percentages. What
What
no, not-
profession?
not-
Yeah.
Not what profession, but for the professions that get the maximum percentages, what is the maximum percentage?
yeah, and it doesn't look much higher than this, but I'll see if I can find that and show it to you. So, yeah, I would say probably the maximum is like, if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a bit since I looked at that cut, because we ended up not doing anything really compared to other professions. We're really just looking at teachers over time. But I think it's like doctors max. Doctors are consistently at the highest. Lawyers really fluctuate, but then they go real low recently. And you know, kind of like a steady downward. And then no, doctor like 85, I think is probably the highest they go. And really you don't see much fluctuation with doctors at all. So doctors, it's kind of like this. Lawyers, it's kind of like this. Basketball players, they ask about some, or like sports players, it's kind of like this. So you really don't see in very many other professions where they've asked about for a long time, these big fluctuations. Firefighter gets good prestige and it increases pretty much over time. But I'll see if I can find, I'll look around and see if I can find it. But if I'm remembering right, I think doctors are consistently at the top and the highest they go is like 84, 85.
What professions get 40% or 20% or 95%?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, and so then we could also look at the low. I think this is about the lowest you get for most of the professions that they ask about consistently. Like, I think teachers down here are like similar to lawyers.
Okay.
Lawyers are like real low at the end, yeah.
That's 30 years.
Not 30 years old. Lawyers have a consistent, yeah. But I'll try to find it. I wish I had included in the slides because now I'm just doing it from memory, but it's in an earlier presentation, so I think, but it might be a relative percent change, which is not really what you're asking about. Yeah. But anyway, our focus is really just on teaching compared to itself, not necessarily relative to some other professions. Yeah, so here we see starting about 2008, a really rapid decline in, and this is of great magnitude if you think about where it was. So we see between 2008 or the 2009, I can't remember what year this is, to the present day, the percent of parents that would say they would want their child to teach drops by over half. So, I mean, a really dramatic drop in at least the way that parents in our country are viewing teachers. So then that's sort of those are our two measures of prestige. For student interest in teaching, we have a few different measures as well. So this is thinking about this stage of, okay, you're in high school or you're in college. If you're in high school, you might need to decide. It sort of matters if you want to go into teaching because, so like for me, for example, I went to Rice University in Houston. They don't offer a degree in teaching. So there are different pathways. But if you go to, you know, a different university that does offer an undergraduate degree, then you sort of need to decide that before you enter college. So I want to go into a teacher preparation program right from the get-go. So this is looking at college freshmen. And here we have good data going on. It's a nationally representative sample of college freshmen collected by CURP. Actually, the survey goes back to the 60s, but we just start in the 70s to keep it consistent. And this is a massive sample. It's typically about 375,000 college freshmen that take it. And you can see about 1 in 5 college freshmen reported that they expected a career in teaching in 1970. This drops incredibly quickly to just a little over 5% by 1981, 82. Then we see some recovery, never really reaches never reaches pre-1970 or 1970 levels, but we see about 1 in 10 college freshmen say they expect to go into teaching. And then starting around 2010, we see another real clear drop to actually the lowest recorded level that we have, where like 4% of college freshmen are saying they expect to go into teaching by 2015 or 16, I can't remember the exact date. And then a tiny recovery, and sometimes people will show this kind of like from here and say, oh, but there's a real recovery. But if you look at this really in the big scheme of things, we're talking about tinkering at the margins, right? The tiny recovery there. And then we also have, for some of these measures, I thought y'all might be interested in New York State specific data. So we're using nationally representative samples. Sometimes we can get it where it's representative at the state level. The CURP data, we can just look at universities in New York State. So this is for people who are college freshmen in universities in New York State. What does this look like? And actually, I don't think I think I did it by their home state. So this is kids who consider New York their home state, no matter what college they're in. Sorry, I said it wrong. And so you can see this familiar 1970s drop. It starts off a little bit lower in New York State than it does relative to the rest of the country, and it drops a little bit lower. And then you can see the recovery is not as clear, you know, and not as quick. And then, but actually gets higher. So this is higher than national averages up in early 2000s for college freshmen who are from New York saying that they expect to go into teaching. And then we see a more significant, more dramatic drop in New York State relative to other states in the country, where even fewer, we're talking about 3% of kids from New York State go into college saying they expect to become teachers. With a slightly larger recovery than other states, but still we're talking about a very, very low percent. And then we can also think about high school seniors. So there's a survey, Monitoring the Future, that used to be a MetLife survey, and now it's sort of commissioned by someone else, but the survey's gone on since 1976, and this is asking about students, how desirable they see going into teaching in a classroom or university. So this one is not perfect because they say classroom or university, but it's still interesting to us that this really follows a similar trend where you see, so I wouldn't focus as much on the magnitude because of the classroom or university component of the question, but you see a big drop in the 70s, a recovery, and then around 2010, a little before, another decline where, again, we're reaching levels that were not much higher than half of what they were 10, 15 years ago in terms of high school students who say they want to go into teaching. NCS, the National Center for Education Statistics, does have some surveys of high school seniors that ask about their expected career. They're really great surveys, but they only do them infrequently. So you can see we don't have very many data points here, but this is helpful, I think, because it's just asking a nationally representative sample of high school students, what do they expect to be doing when they're 30 years old? And this is the percent that say they expect to be teaching. And again, you can see, even though it's sort of coarse, these patterns still where we see a decline in the 1970s. So about 7% of high school seniors say they expect to be teaching. In 1972, that declines to about 3% in 1980, 1981, recovers. And then we can see it's sort, we don't really have anything post 2010, but still shows a similar pattern. So then we can also look at teacher preparation. So this is education degrees and then teacher licenses. And here this is just straight up data on the number of degree completers in education. So this is kind of data the federal government has been super good at collecting and is now it's really an open question if these data will continue to be collected, but it's excellent data on the universe of bachelor's degree completers. And so this is the percent of this is the number of bachelor's degree completers that are getting education bachelor's degree. I also have it as a percent. And you can see 1972 or so, we see this big decline where we had 300,000 bachelor's degree completers that were getting degrees in education, drop down to about 160,000, recovers after that drop in the mid 80s, and then recovers back up to about 270,000, 275,000 by 2010. And then we're seeing this real dramatic drop in 2010 again, and then a sort of leveling off at about, we're talking about 225,000 relative to a high of 275, 279. And again, a slight indication that maybe between 2022 and 23, we saw a little recovery, but really not even close to where the number of graduates was in 2009. This is now showing this in New York State. And so we don't have for the, this is data from iPads and also from Hedges was the original name of the survey. They don't break it up by state, so you can't get it by state until about 2010. So this, I'm just showing you that period that we were observing on the last figure. And then this is what it looks like in New York State. So you can see a really dramatic drop. And that's sort of indicative of a broader trend when I can break things out by New York State, where the fluctuations are sort of more dramatic than in other states. So here, a drop of 26,000 education BA or MA completers in 2009, dropping to just 15,000 by 2019 in New York.
There seems to be no fluctuation. It just drops.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So
That's the only.
yeah, because that's and that's what's essentially happening in
That-
this period. Yeah. So so the trend is similar in New York State to the federal trend here.
Well, by the way, isn't that similar to any degree? Number of degrees.
Oh,
granted
number of
across
degree
the-
completers?
All degrees. I know demographically here in New York State, where the number of kids being born today is 20% less than it was 10 years ago. So we're
Yeah.
guaranteed to see these drop with time.
But no, because so this is the same thing as a percent. So you can see it's less start percent of degree.
The absolute number of degrees.
Sure. So this is now taking I mean, I could show you the absolute number of degrees. The number of degrees is going down too, but what you really want to know is as a proportion of all degrees, how does education fall?
Yeah, no, it's becoming a less.
Yes.
relatively less major,
Yes.
popular, but the total.
So the total is going down. So this you can see is less stark. But this is the number of degree completers in education divided by the total number of degree completers for MA and BA degrees. So you can see that again, we see, and this is consistent with student interest, right? About 1 in 4 college freshmen were saying they wanted to go into teaching in 1970, and about 1 in 4 did. Then that drops to about 13% in the 80s, in the 70s, down to about 30% mid 80s, stays about there, recovers a little bit, and then the percent that of degree completers that are majoring in education really declines again for the first time starting around 2010, a little bit before the recession. So this is like 2006 is the last number here before the decline. And a tiny recovery. And then this is the percent in New York State. And again, so here it's helpful, I think, because the trend is more dramatic in New York State. So you can see that the slope is straighter in New York than it is in the rest of the country. If we think about this as a percent. So this is licenses. This, I think, we only have data going back to 2000, but is one of the most dramatic falls. So the peak of licenses in teacher licenses is 2006, when this is as a percent. I think I sort of like it as a number better first. So this is, as a country, we were administering, this is again, the census of teacher licenses. This data is kept by the Office of Title II in the Federal Department of Education. And so 2000 and I said 2006, but 2006 is a peak. You have over 320,000 new teacher licenses that year. And then in 2020, 2021, that drops to under 220,000. So this drops by a third of new teacher licenses issued. So this is new teachers entering the teacher workforce, drops by about a third in you know, about 10 years, a little more than 10 years. And then this is as a percent of all BA students, just as a way to sort of like gauge the, because you can't really do it as percent of all BA and MA, so it's a little bit, it's not my favorite measure, but this is as a percent of all undergraduates, what percent of undergraduates earn a license in teaching, and you can see it looks very similar. So it's not just a function of fewer, it's not just what you're worried about, just a function of fewer people getting college degrees. This one I already showed you. Okay, in New York State, it's a little noisier. 2006 is a very funky year in New York State. This is probably a data error. We like emailed them. I emailed the Office of Title II about this, and then they took it down. Now it's just missing that year for New York State. So, yeah. So probably don't focus too much on that point. But yeah, you can see the consistent story of New York State is the trends are more dramatic. So here I'm just trying to like show you relative to the rest of the country. So this is the little circles are New York State licenses per 1,000 students. So this is new teacher licenses per 1,000 students. And then the little diamonds are the average of for all other non-New York states. And so you can see prior to 2013 or so, New York is well above, again, ignore this state. New York is like well above other states in terms of the number of new teacher licenses per thousands of students. And that drop is greater in New York State. So we see, even as we know, enrollment is actually declining in New York State more than in other states also. So,
So how are you counting students here? These are degrees?
no, this is K-12 students. So this
Oh,
is trying to
the
get
number
at,
of
yeah.
students, Not the number of college students pursuing graduate or teaching.
Right,
Okay,
right. The
okay.
prior one was,
I just wanted to clarify.
yeah.
that.
This one is the first time I'm doing it where we might think about demand. We try to like not go into demand because it's so much of it's a whole can of worms. But this is K-12 students. So how many new teacher licenses are you issuing per 1,000 K-12 students? So you'd expect New York to issue more in raw levels because we have more students, right? So we need more teachers because we have more students. But you wouldn't necessarily, we wouldn't necessarily expect a difference once we scale it by the number of students. So you can see they start off higher and then drop lower. We start off higher and drop lower.
Was that so the number of students has?
In New York State?
Yeah, I thought we're on a downward trend. I know in our school district
Yeah.
locally here.
Yeah, so this is,
Maxing out and dropping.
right, so
recently.
so K-12 enrollment is declining in New York State and is declining more in New York State relative to other states. But still, the licenses per 1,000 students, the teacher licenses are declining, even still accounting for those declines in New York. And are declining more than in other states, even relative to, even though we're having declines in student enrollment. Okay, then job satisfaction. There's no one perfect measure of job satisfaction and a lot of imperfect measures. So I'm just gonna show you, we use 6 different measures here from various different sources. The one that goes back the farthest and that we have for the longest period of time is National Education Association did a survey of teachers. They stopped it in 2006. But there you can see this similar pattern, and really across, when we have data going far back enough, we can see these similar patterns of a drop in 1970s, a recovery in the 80s, sort of leveling off. Then the survey of the American teacher, that's the same. This is the MetLife. It's the same, like commissioned by MetLife, but it only goes back to 84. And sometimes they ask about job satisfaction and sometimes asked about career satisfaction, and you get a slightly different answer depending on how exactly they ask the question. So that's why there's 2 different lines. The lower one is job satisfaction and the higher one is career satisfaction, but the career satisfaction one sort of helps to fill in gaps in the job satisfaction. And so here we're sort of continuing on, we see stability essentially up until 2010, and then a big drop. Where job satisfaction in 2022 is down to just 12%, relative here to a high of, 50 or so percent. Just what, 20 years prior. So that's a huge drop. I mean, that's a massive drop in job satisfaction, according to this survey of the American teacher. Schools and Staffing Survey asks a bunch of different questions. This is a federally collected survey of teachers. It usually happens every 2 years, although sometimes it's every 3 years. And we don't see as dramatic of a drop, but of course the scale here is 20 to 100. So you can sort of see this, I guess not as dramatic, but still somewhat consistent drop over this time period, starting much earlier, according to the Schools and Staffing Survey. This is a survey of, I think they survey like 40,000 teachers, and it's a nationally representative sample on a number of different items. But then we do see this starker drop in around the mid 2010s. And then
Am I mishearing you? Are you saying schools and staffing or school staffing?
sorry, Schools and Staffing Survey. It's
Explain the difference.
that's the name of the survey.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, but this is so it's a survey of teachers of, and it's done by the federal government. It's now called the National Teacher and Principal Survey, but for both of them, this is just pulling out the teachers. And this is a number of different questions that sort of get at satisfaction. They don't ask about satisfaction directly. They ask like, do you think the stress of teaching is worth it? How enthusiastic are you about teaching? If you could go back to your undergraduate days, would you choose teaching as a career again? And these look like a steadier decline when we look at this survey, but still a decline nonetheless. And then the AFT also has been doing surveys, not for as long, but again, we see this real decline in American Federation of Teachers surveys of K-12 teachers that are AFT members. So again, no one perfect measure, but pretty similar, this really stark trends over time that map on to many, many different measures of the state of the profession. And in the most present year, across all of these, essentially we see that levels are sort of at or near their lowest levels over the past 50 years. So when we think about prestige, fell between 20% and 40% in the past 10 years. Interest fell 50% since the 1990s, and then about 40% since 2010. Preparation, we saw, I mentioned that new teachers' licenses fell by about 1/3 since over the last decade. And then getting to satisfaction, the percent of teachers who say the stress is worth it, that's one of the questions from the Schools and Staffing Survey, dropped from about 81% to 42% in the past 15 years. So across 18 different data sets, even more measures from those data sets, we really find these similar patterns over time, and we see real stark decreases since about 2010 in the state of the profession in terms of these prestige, interest, preparation, and satisfaction. So this is sort of a start point in the presentation. I do have the next step of this is trying to look at explanations that might point to like potential places to look for policy levers to switch. But I did want to pause. I like getting questions throughout, and I'm glad you guys were asking, but if there were any other folks who had comments or questions but didn't want to ask earlier, it's a good time.
When I was in high school in 1969, and we had our first African-American teacher, he was my English teacher, and he said, I remember right after Martin Luther King was assassinated.
Yeah.
He said, the only careers open to a Black man is teacher or preacher.
Yeah.
And today the opportunities are much larger.
Yeah.
And I'd say the same thing is true for women going into, for instance, today, more than 50% of the PhDs in this country are going to women.
Yeah.
And so is there an opportunity issue that could be driving some of the trends that you're seeing?
Yes, so that tees me up super well for the first explanation. So I'll show you this because good answer, and then we can go back and if other folks, I don't have to continue on the rest if other folks have comments. So this is probably the number one explanation for what was happening in the 70s, and then even to some extent the recovery in the 80s, but especially the fall in the 70s. So, and there's been some good work in the economics literature, some economists of education have studied this in more micro levels than the sort of broad trends that we're doing in this paper and found really similar results that the expansion of labor market opportunities for women and people of color really shaped the prestige of the profession and what, not something that we're able to look at, but what economists have also looked at previously is, and the sort of aptitude or the like essentially test scores of the new entrants into the profession also decreases dramatically in this period as sort of high achieving women and high achieving people of color are now able, their labor market opportunities are really expanded. So this is a sort of,
Today, when you say this,
yeah, so this one is again going 1970 to 2017, I think is my last date. And so, and here is showing the trends relative to their base in 1970 across different groups. So like men have a lower likelihood at baseline of saying they want to go into teaching, but then men, both white and black men, this is just white and black, but we separate it out by Hispanic and Asians in the paper. The drop is not as stark for men, and it's starkest for black women. So, and black women you can think of as the most exposed to these expanding labor market opportunities because they were affected on two layers of inequality, right? And then also white men have the greatest recovery back up to their 1970 or so levels in terms of their interest in teaching. And so we think this is probably a good explanation for like what's happening in early periods, but more recently, it just doesn't track on the same way. Because if anything, fewer, so this is just a graph I found, but from equitable growth, but if anything, fewer women are now entering the labor market than were 10, 15 years ago. And so you would expect the opposite, right? So teaching, you would expect to become, if the trend was the same as it had been in the past, you would expect increasing prestige, increasing status of the profession as fewer women are entering the labor market. But
labor market, education.
labor market generally, yeah. And there's been, I mean, no real expansions of labor market opportunities for women and people of color in the past 15 or so years. No like systematic expansions, maybe sort of gradual, but those would be continuations of prior trends. So we see that as a really good explanation for what was happening in the 70s fall, but not as a potential explanation for what's happening more recently. And there are other hypotheses that we sort of look at and do eyeball tests, but I do want, if there's other comments or questions, we don't have to go into all the hypotheses yet.
I'm seeing economic, socio-political, policy, technology.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And most people think about technology as not as much affecting the teaching profession, but it's a good point.
I would say smartphones in the class.
Phones, yeah. So I mean, we did think about this with like class size, that some people thought maybe technology could replace teachers, but and I don't think I have this, it's in the paper, but I don't have it on here. The class size trend is sort of the opposite of what you expect. Class sizes are getting smaller rather than bigger. So that like technology angle doesn't totally pan out just on the eyeball test, but phones making teachers feel miserable is, I think,
Surveillance.
Yeah.
Teacher behavior.
yeah,
We're using computational tools.
yeah,
We had a dissertation done in my department just this past just this past year.
Uh-huh.
And looking at the way that that administrators were surveilling their own teaching
Yeah.
staff in their use of smartphones and computational tools in the classroom. And teachers were pretty upset
Yeah.
about this.
Well, there was a period right around, I think it's really, I'm into like surveillance as a concept that we should be studying more. There was a period around the time of towards the end of really the worst parts of the pandemic, when there had been a lot of hybrid instruction, a lot of Zoom instruction, and there were some post-ed reformers who were saying, we have a camera in every classroom now, maybe we should be using that to record teachers all the time and use that for their evaluations. And that could provide better data, because people complain that evaluations, the principal comes once a year or something. And that did not go anywhere. The teachers, for obvious reasons, teachers don't want to be surveilled all the time. And I do think that there's a good point that just like with technological advances, period, we've sort of increased surveillance. One somewhat related thing that we do look at is like accountability reforms. And I'll jump to that one too. Yeah. So I think it's sort of fun to talk about these in context anyway. So, and we'll come back yet.
Earlier was the opportunities to do computer programming, drew people away from math and science teaching.
Uh-huh. And yeah, that's certainly true. And so, when we look at teacher shortages now, they're consistently starkest for special education teachers and math and science teachers. Like across the board, across any states, that's like the real areas of shortage. And the special education teachers know, but the math and science teachers, that's attributed to better outside opportunities. Sort of an easier way, if you major in engineering, for example, do you decide that you're going to teach engineering in like a CTE program, or you could teach math because you've taken enough math classes, or you could teach science or physics or something, or do you take a job as an engineer? And there are more jobs as engineers than there are as, folks relative to folks who major in English, right? And so there's probably a paying teachers more, you probably have to, at some point, we'll probably have to grapple with the fact that we're going to have to pay math and science teachers more if we want to have math and science classrooms staffed. We could pay all teachers more, and that is what the union is pushing for. And there is like difficulty with paying math and science teachers more, because that also kind of sets you up for some implicit gender pay gaps, which is partly what unions were really introducing the single salary schedule in order to avoid those major gender pay gaps. And now we really don't see it in education. But the shortages have been more consistent in math and science. Going back to
and backgrounds would draw people away from special education teaching.
So I think actually we're probably getting enough degrees in special education teachers, but they're often paired with a generalist certificate. And once special ed teachers get into the classroom, they switch and or they just become general educators, not special education teachers. It's a very difficult job.
Yeah.
And it's right now it's a lot of paperwork. That's actually what we look at, like working conditions and paperwork, but for special education teachers, it's complicated, but there's probably enough licensed special education teachers, but the actual job is not desirable enough, and the pay differential there doesn't exist. So you don't have a compensating differential for a more difficult job. And it can be, you don't get the same relationships with students because you're doing pullouts, you don't have the same class anyway. But okay, going back to the surveillance piece, this is not exactly it, but one sort of way to kind of get at this is so the hypothesis we're thinking about here is related to accountability. And I have actually a few more figures in the paper on this, but, and sort of tracing the new accountability reforms. And but a lot of them start around the time of Race to the Top. Race to the Top really incentivizes essentially incentivize states to force districts to connect student test scores to teacher evaluations. And so that is in a way a technological form of surveillance. Because you can think about this as like the best or one possible quantitative measure that would in a way kind of surveil the progress that teachers had been able to make. And so there's a lot of research on these evaluation reforms. And in general, the two big findings from the literature on these evaluation reforms, not from our paper, from others, is that in some places like DC, they really worked for improving the composition of the teacher workforce. So it didn't make teachers work harder. It was able to attract and retain higher performing teachers. Second, that it didn't really affect student achievement in aggregate. Actually, a third one. Okay, a third major takeaway from that literature is also that very few teachers were actually fired as a result of these teacher evaluation reforms. And so the original motivation for these was like 98% of teachers are rated satisfactory. And, when obviously there's more of a distribution. And still 98% of teachers are still rated satisfactory. Very, very few teachers actually got fired as a result of these reforms. But still, there was a perception that teachers' jobs were less secure. And I think that that perception that jobs were less secure, or the perception of that feeling of being surveilled, did affect the teachers' feelings about how secure they were in their jobs. So even though, like, if you look at rates of teacher firings, there's no dramatic increase in teacher firings with all these teacher evaluation reforms. And indeed, very, very few actually ended up leading to any meaningful change in teacher firings at all. But there was meaningful change in teachers feeling secure in their jobs. So teachers felt more anxious about their jobs. And we can see that declines really in line with these teacher evaluation reforms that happen. And with this kind of 2010 drop, then we don't have a ton of data. So this is 2017, 2018. This is the schools and staffing survey, the Good Federal Survey. And then this is a pandemic when there were no tests. So you can see, take the tests away and just like, and this is meaningful. So I don't know if you can see the scale. So here we're at 40%. This is like 42% of teachers say they're secure in their jobs. Then 2017, 2018, that's down to like 27%. And then 2021, 2021, during the pandemic, these tests are canceled. This is like the first real year of the pandemic. It's back up to like about 41 or so percent. And even with the pandemic surveillance, because it wasn't being used to evaluate teachers, because the surveillance wasn't, parents were sort of doing some of that. And maybe that would play out a little bit later as kind of parents started to, but this time point is pre the Moms for Liberty type stuff. Okay, what other, you had a comment, question? Yeah.
Yeah, if we could go back to the one on economic and social political. I'm assuming that unions would connect across both of those.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And at some point, I hope we can talk about your argument about the political economy, because I'm interested in how you think about it. Because those are very interesting years, and there's a long history of interesting change in US education. So I hope we can.
Yes, so
in due course.
And I think it's really so I'm really interested in the union role in this. And I think that there is a potential future paper on specifically the union role in this. There's some really good historical work on unions and the way that unions, and this is true actually for other labor groups outside of teachers as well, but teachers unions especially, the way that teachers unions historically, even when you look at sort of the founding of the modern teachers union in like early 1900s. So 1857 is really the first teachers union, but it's an administrators union for a long time. so, and administrators, they were more focused on, you know, it was a little bit clearer for them. But when we start to really see the modern teachers union appear, there's a big question about whether teachers are middle class or working class, whether the relationship with the union helps to make the teachers seem more professional, or whether it associates them with labor. And because of like the perception of labor in the US as being something more working class, then ultimately lowers the perception of the prestige. So there were these real core, like well-documented debates happening at the founding of teachers unions and at the different periods of union expansion that I think are really fascinating. And I think the union role in this is really, really complicated. So what I'm showing you here is just time series figures of teachers union membership counts over time. So, and this is for the NEA and the AFT, the National Education Association, American Federation of Teachers. I can't just smush them together because the NEA and the AFT, they merge in some states and not in others. So like you can't just add up the two graphs, but we can look at them to the side and we can see, I think it's complicated, okay? And just hear me out, and I'm definitely open to talking about this more. So 1970s, this period is a huge period for the fall of the status of the profession, right? And this is the same time period that we really see collective bargaining expansion. So first collective bargaining law for teachers is 1961 in Wisconsin. And then we see New York City comes about the same time, but that's at the city level. And then we see a lot of the states follow course, 1966, 1967, 1963. We see a lot of states pick up, and really then we get collective bargaining in 34 states. 44 states, all but 6 states end up with collective bargaining. So in this time period of expansion, this happens at the same time as the original fall. Now, it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg, I think, with why that time period might have produced both a fall in the profession and an increase in unionization. So you could think, so nothing here is causal, and I think it's hard to make an argument that one caused the other. I think you might be more pushed to unionize because, and I'll show you also, salaries are dropping a lot in this period. So you may be more pushed to unionize at the same time that the status of the profession is falling. Or the status of the profession, if you want to, you know, be anti-union, then you can say the status of the profession is falling because they're unionizing and the union is ruining the profession. So you could say, yeah, what do you say? So this is not anything causal, but I think that, and it is certainly true that the status of the profession is declining at the same time that we're seeing collective bargaining laws expansion and really rapid expansions of union membership numbers. Then 2010, I think it's really hard to ignore that 2010 and a little bit before was the period when states really started to both publicly, rhetorically attack teachers' unions and really roll back the protections. So Wisconsin, for example, has Act 10 in 2011 that, you know, this is the first state to expand collective bargaining rights and then does a major rollback of collective bargaining rights for teachers in 2011. And the accompanying political rhetoric that came along with that, I think it's very hard to ignore the way that could have shaped the prestige of the profession and student interest in becoming a profession. So you can think about Waiting for Superman I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. It's a movie came out in 2012 that was really painted a sort of bleak picture of what was happening in K-12 schools and pointed the blame on teachers and teachers unions as sort of the major kind of systemic factor that was causing these bad teachers to remain in schools. And so I think that the relationship with the union is really complicated, but what we do see is that there's this positive correlation with unionization in the 1970s, and then a negative correlation. So at the same time that or this is really the negative correlation, and this is the positive correlation. But at the same time that we see union membership dropping, and that happens alongside this, rollbacks of union protections and the political rhetoric that went around these rollbacks for union protections. This is also the time when we see the more recent drop. So I think this is probably part of the explanation for some of the more recent drop. But it's, it could also be a chicken or the egg. Maybe maybe the unions really were protecting bad teachers, and so yeah.
You have to get, or is it relevant on how many people are working part-time in these jobs? Because in academic work.
Yeah.
there's a vast
Yeah.
Reversal in the number.
Yeah.
Of faculty that were tenured faculty and the ones that were
Adjuncts, yeah.
And I
No,
don't know
no.
how that shows up in K-12.
Because in the way that the federal government tracks K-12 teachers, which is like these are really it's difficult, and they do it as full-time equivalents. And so if you have like, if you had 20% teachers, that would count the same as one single teacher. In the tracking, like in our data collection efforts, that coming out of the federal government. So there's not really a way to parse that out. Certainly in the period of cuts that happened around the time of the Great Recession, K-12 full-time instructional teacher positions were, this is not something I show, but this has been documented elsewhere. It's sort of the opposite. So they really kept the classroom teacher positions, dropped librarians, dropped music teachers, dropped instructional aides. And so you see big drops in teacher support positions that are can sometimes be part-time. They're not always part-time, and certainly lower paid. Essentially, a lot of those positions get cut. And so a lot of the strikes recently have been teacher strikes, but that are pushing for a return. We want our nurses back. We want our instructional aides back. We want librarians back in the schools. So at least, the narrative, it's a little bit hard to say. The positions that were cut, though, were not the K-12 classroom teacher, licensed teacher positions for the most part.
I know my public school that I went to and private school, number of administrators.
Yeah.
A generation ago, it looks like that number has mushroomed.
It has,
Based
yeah,
on
yeah,
parking lots at administration
Yeah.
buildings, cubicle farms
Yeah,
now
yeah.
that never existed.
Yeah.
No administrators left behind. I guess I'm just curious, many of these surveys include the staff, the non-teaching staff, or you separated that out, you mentioned?
No. So if there was ever, schools and staffing survey that they'll survey the K-12 teachers and the administrators separately, we only use the
Well,
K-12 teachers.
I guess my general.
Yeah.
What does this look like for administrator satisfaction, administrator stress, administrator, I'm curious.
Yeah, I haven't looked, but it's an answerable question. So they do have the schools and staffing survey now, national teacher and principal survey does have administrator side. Sorry, I said that word. Administrator survey. And I think they do have similar questions on there, like that are not exactly satisfaction, but getting at it. And I haven't looked at those yet.
The other thing I'm curious about, I went to private school, Catholic school. What you mentioned, there's 4 million K-12 teachers. How many are those are private school? What's the approximate breakdown? Is it 10%?
So I'm doing it by memory, but I think it's 4.2 million public and private K-12 teachers. And if you look just public, I think it's 3.7 million.
It's about 10%.
So,
No, 10%.
Okay.
Well, I guess I'm just.
You
curious
guys,
what-
yeah.
Well, we gotta, anybody got a
Catholic
calculator?
schools have been closing.
Yeah, Catholic schools have been really hit hard. In the
Well, no,
past
they've
10
been
years. Yeah.
yuppieizing, they've been upscaling in a lot of ways. But anyway, I'm just curious if you have you looked or differentiated private versus public?
Yeah.
Charter schools versus public schools,
Yeah, and
private schools versus public schools. Have you looked at that? And are there big differences in any of these trends, do you think?
so we did do quite a few of that because we weren't really sure at the beginning of the project. Are we talking about traditional K-12 public? Or are we talking about teachers at large? And in general, it looks really similar across the board. And so we ended up, essentially, we're talking about teachers writ large, K-12, public, private, charter, whatever. But, and then charter tricky. So public and private, the trends look similar on satisfaction and stuff. Charter is a little bit tricky, but we can look at, I'm trying to remember if I have it in here or not. Another figure that I have and is in the paper, but is not in this presentation is, we can look at licenses by traditional license versus alternative certification, which is much more common in the charter schools. For the teachers, anyway, so we can look at that preparation side, and the trends look similar. It's hit harder for, like, the drop is bigger in numerical terms for traditional certifications. But you also do see, it's just that there are so many more. And you do see a similar drop in alternative certifications, even though we think of charter expansion as really happening in this time period. There, it turns out, you know, like the traditional alternative might not be the perfect proxy, because there's a pretty steady stream of alternative certifications up until around 2008 or so, and then you see a drop there too. Not as big as for traditional, but still a drop. Yeah. I can't remember the exact numbers, but a lot of these don't distinguish. Like the prestige polls, for example, and anything related to prestige, the PDK question, like how much do you respect teachers? They're really just saying K-12 teachers, or they'll say elementary and secondary teachers. They won't say, you know, public or private.
Is there anything interesting in comparing public versus private charter schools?
So, I mean, kind of that question would be depending on who you ask. So, charter schools are publicly funded, but they're privately governed, but they all are essentially the same in that regard. So yeah. So they're they can be authorized by different entities. The ones that are authorized by school districts sometimes, and this is also a challenge separating things out by charter schools, because if you're a charter school but you're authorized by a school district, like is the case with a lot of New York City charter schools, then you will show up in the numbers as a traditional public school teacher because you show up in the New York City Department of Education numbers rather than a totally separate district, even though functionally you're governed by the charter board, not the chancellor. So it's complicated, but yeah, this is a period of charter expansion too. And there could be something related to that. Typically, people think about charters as increasing the prestige of the profession, but so that's that we don't find any, at least eyeball tests, that would be the case.
It's some really good looking figures.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So we have 9 different hypotheses that we pull from the literature. I'm not going to go over all of them. Some of them I already did, but the ones. So I've got I colored in green the ones that where we find like there's some similarity in trends, at least for some time periods. And those are the ones that I included in the presentation. So the big picture is there's no smoking gun. There's no silver bullet. It took us 10 years to get here, and it's not going to be a quick fix. There's not going to be any quick fix, but there is hope. Because like we've seen a similar fluctuation before, right? So the teaching profession really declined in the 70s, but it recovered. And so I think that it's not that it has to be this way or that there's no hope. We've seen real fluctuation over time in the profession. And so we could see a change, but that I think will take some real reckoning on the part of governments on multiple levels and as a society about like, who do we want standing in front of our kids? So the one that we really find, so we talked about the changing labor market opportunities. I think this is the best explanation for the 70s fall. And then the one that we really find the most consistent, where I think it maps the most consistently, is salary. So this is real teacher salaries, inflation adjusted over time. And you can see, we see a decline in the 70s. This happened, this is a little bit complicated and I'll show you why in a minute. Rise in the 80s. This is real salaries, remember, so this is inflation adjusted. If you look not inflation adjusted, it's not gonna look like a decline. Some of this decline is because of inflation. There's a rise in the 80s, levels off, and then I'll talk about this in a second. What we're interested in is this 2010 drop. So this is post-recession. So we know teacher salaries are cut, but then they don't really go back. And they still on average are not reaching pre-2008 recession levels. And this really maps on to what, like, I think this is a core area where we should be looking at and this is according to any measure of occupational prestige. Sometimes the measures of occupational prestige themselves are just salary, like some funky math with salaries. So I think like the relationship between salary and prestige feels very tight, and the relationship, and you saw prestige tracks with all of our other measures. And so it's not a kind of major surprise to say salary is a place to look, but what I think is notable is how much the actual fluctuations in real salaries, the way they're experienced, follow the trends that we've seen. This is the 2022 number because the salaries really dropped because of the inflation in 2022. So this one, you know, this one's sort of a funky number. The one that we're really interested in is this one.
That could be demographic, right? I think that could be correlated exactly with teacher age. In other words, you have a younger teach force.
Right, yeah,
They're
then-
hired in at the lower.
Yeah, yeah.
They progress up. So do you track teacher?
So if you,
For instance, no, how many years have you been a teacher? Is that surveyed?
it is in the National Teacher and Principal Survey. We can look at measures of experience for a shorter period of time. So from like here to here, this one, the actual raw dollar number isn't going down.
Yeah, that's inflation, but
Yeah.
I'm just suggesting that what you might be looking at there is just turnover for the older, higher paid staff with younger, lower paid staff.
So if that were happening, you would expect the raw number to go down because this is the average salary. So it would be pulled down by
But
yeah,
you're hiring a bunch of new teachers.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
the old teachers
Yeah.
retired, the highest paid teachers left.
right.
That's-
So
it could be a factor, it's all.
yeah, but the raw number, not inflation adjusted, isn't going down.
Yeah.
So if that were happening, you would, I mean, it could be there's probably some of that happening to some extent, but
Yeah.
if that were the main cause, then we'd
That's
see
the
the
one
raw
that
number
could be
decrease. This could be, yeah,
Right.
so the actual number is declining because inflation is, yeah, so inflation is lower, right? There's a recession. So this is, could be, this is cuts, and it could be, like, the actual dollar figure numbers are going down,
Or the
not just
rising
inflation
in
adjusted.
age. It's the aging of the teaching pool is getting more and more
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. So that could be part of the explanation for any of these, except this
Yeah.
last one, yeah. This also is related to the number of students in an important way, especially in like these periods. So you kind of have to acknowledge this. This one is a little bit complicated. But public school students are declining here because this is like post-baby boom. And this we can think of as like a contraction in the teacher labor market. So this is potentially also an explanation for what's happening in the 1970s that's gotten less attention, much less attention than the expanding labor market explanation. But you do see that like fewer teachers are going to be needed. And that's sort of consistent, right? Where like at the very least, they're not increasing the numbers of teachers in this period, and there is a little drop. And then you see like birth rates essentially increase and the number of students increases quite a bit at the same time that the profession is increasing and salaries are increasing. So you may have, a better, essentially an expansion of the teacher labor market happening in this 1980s period. If we think about this today, there's not going to, like, if anything, the public school students seem to be declining. There's this big drop in the pandemic where we really haven't recovered from. and across the board in every state. Some states have. But you don't really expect that we're gonna see a dramatic increase in the number of students. If anything, it seems to be going the other direction. And it's a little bit unclear what like the policy lever there would be. I guess if you are really thinking like heavy hand, you could try to encourage more children to be born, but I think that as a policy lever.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, immigration would be one potential policy lever. So that's a couple other, question, yeah.
I'll take you on a different road.
Mhm.
The last screen you had, where you had the salary,
Yeah,
how did they deal with the part-time, full-time issue
so this is,
in these numbers?
yeah, so this is data collected by the National Education Association on average K-12 classroom teacher salaries. They keep track of instructional aides separately. So this is not, you could calculate in expenditure, and I have done this. You could calculate separately expenditures on instructional salaries and divide that by the full-time equivalent. So then that would also encapsulate the aides and stuff. But this number is not. This is just like K-12 classroom teachers, what are their salaries? So the NEA has been doing this data collection for a long time and gets these from local unions and has a whole data team. So this is what the federal government uses for their digest. This is the Digest of Education Statistics is put out by the National Center for Education Statistics, and they use the NEA's numbers here. So this is like from a combination of surveys of K-12 teachers and also just like getting the union collective bargaining agreements and getting data from union folks.
Yeah, but there's not too many part-time teachers.
No, it would be like instructional aides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think the question you're addressing is, in college, we're doing a lot of part-time.
Yeah.
But that doesn't apply to K-12.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
are no part-time, at least when my kids went through North Colony schools, there was I never met one part-time teacher there.
Right, we don't really have an equivalent, and because
Substitutes would be the same.
yes,
No idea the volume of substitutes schools in New York or elsewhere.
It's huge.
That's where the, you know, the kind of, those who are really struggling stay with the education.
yeah, I mean, so
No, that's-
so there's no real parallel between K-12 and higher ed on the adjunct question. Even with substitutes, in almost every state, the substitutes still have to be licensed K-12 teachers. And so there's less of it, so they are part-time in that sense, like where you can just sort of call them up and they're like gig economy more,
Yeah.
right? But because they still have to be licensed, they're still sort of more encapsulated into this. In a lot of districts, the substitute teachers are like retired teachers or like stay-at-home moms that had left the profession but are still coming back in a limited extent. So there is some parallel there. With instructional aides, because instructional aides are typically not licensed and usually don't have a BA, they're really not, you can't have an instructional aide legally lead a classroom on their own. So in any state, I don't think, that could change. I mean, and then we would see something probably much more similar to the adjuncting, where we would call upon people and have them teach at much lower rates in more of a ad hoc type situation. But because the instructional, so even if we did increase in instructional aides, that they would have to be sort of supervised by a classroom teacher. Now, one kind of interesting thing that could happen that a lot of districts, especially charter schools, are playing with right now is to have a massive class size, right? So, and this is sort of similar to what the school where I taught in was doing. But I've seen this even to a greater extent, where you have like maybe one teacher and 45 or 50 kids, and then you have one instructional aide too. And so then you have one licensed teacher, one instructional aide, and a massive classroom, and you have a lot of the kids on computers. And
Our lectures.
Yeah. Yeah, so, but that, and then that in some ways is almost more like a TA, like a professor type situation, but it's a method of dealing with teacher shortages that, I think is questionable in terms of its efficacy for student achievement. But it's something that people, are studying, and I've studied a little bit. So yeah, let me get through. Okay, so I talked to you guys about accountability. Oh, and I think so this is the last of the hypotheses I wanted to make sure to mention is safety. This gets brought up a lot. And when people think about school safety in this like big picture, how it might affect the status of the profession, I do think a lot of people are thinking about school shootings. And it is incredibly sad to present this figure. And I just didn't realize like how much it feels like it's increased, and it has certainly increased. I mean, so this is from the Department of Homeland Security and so they collect data on any like shootings that happen in or around K-12 schools. And so this is the number of school shootings. It has gone up exponentially. That's been really just the past 10 years. And the big rise doesn't really happen until 2017. So this is probably not the only thing affecting the status of the profession, but I think it is something that we should be talking about more. And it feels incredibly sad to even look at that graph to me. And then so that's one way to think about safety is like school shootings. I think that's a lot of the national perception. And then we can also think about just the like everyday kind of sort of smaller violences that happen. And so this is teachers that are threatened. Teachers that report being threatened is in circles, and physically attacked is diamond. So it's a little bit complicated, but it looks like, that it's declining. At least the threatened one is declining in between about 1998 until 2005 or so, then seems to increase up until 2010, and then has been decreasing since 2010. This is the like feeling threatened or being threatened. And then the sort of similar trend with being physically attacked. So if anything, these sort of smaller violences seem to be decreasing in schools at the same period where we see the profession is decreasing. So probably these smaller violences, not a major cause of declines in the state of the profession. So this is 1990. Sorry, I think I said 1998, but this actually looks like 1993 up until 2021. And then this is 1970 to 2020. The numbers going way back on the Department of Homeland Security may not be as accurate, but the fact that they're consistent and so low, even in the more recent reporting, I think makes me feel confident that these are like some people don't use the like pre-1990 numbers or the pre-1980 numbers, but if you just look at them, they look pretty consistent over this period, except for just recently. And I think pretty much everybody thinks post 1990, the Homeland Security numbers are pretty good. So yeah, big picture, what does this mean? The status of the profession is at or near its lowest in the past 50 years. This is not just from the pandemic. This was building since around 2010, a little bit before. When we think about New York State specifically, the highs seem to be higher, but the lows seem to be lower. So New York, for whatever reason, has more dramatic fluctuations than the rest of the country. And there's probably not going to be any kind of silver bullet, like I said, but there is hope. So, but I think that we should make sure that, like, as a society, we are patient and that we don't expect for anything to sort of dramatically change the state of the K-12 teaching profession in the short term. And I think that, we had a working paper come out, and quite a few, the paper got cited in quite a few different national outlets. These are some of the ones that cite the paper, and I think like part of that is shifting. I think we've been able to be part of a shifting discourse on the state of the profession, where even though this is really something that's been building since 2010 or so, or even before, that the nation has potentially started to at least acknowledge that this is a concern, and try to come up with ways to increase the state of the profession. So I don't feel this as like, I don't see this as lacking hope. I think there is hope that this could improve. So we, like I said before, there was, you know, we've been to a low point in the mid 80s, and then there was an increase, and it wasn't just fluctuations in the expansion of the labor market or in inflation. Like real salaries really did go up. So I just found this old New York Times headline about teachers getting a major pay raise in New York City in 85. And this is right around the time, you know, that this, that things were turning around. So we have seen, we have been in a low point, and we've turned it around before with real policy changes. And in the 1980s, we see like probably the factors that helped turn things around at that period were the increasing enrollment, so the expansion of the labor market, higher pay, and also potentially a national discourse that was sort of spurred or perhaps like manifest in some of the discussions around a nation at risk and the importance of education for being a competitive country in the global economy. So what about now? So we think now, I think places where there could be policy levers to look at would be compensation, also thinking about autonomy. So as we were talking about before, teacher evaluation really didn't end up with a lot of teachers getting fired, but did change the nature of how people perceived the risks of teaching. I think that historically, the types of teachers K-12 teachers, the types of people that have decided to enter into the K-12 teaching profession have been more risk averse. And so if you make the profession riskier, but don't increase any compensating differential, then it's not really a surprise to see that the profession becomes less desirable. So I think really trying to find ways to like improve the workforce, but also at the same time, not do that in a way that threatens teacher autonomy or makes the profession less desirable. It's a challenge. I'm not saying that's easy, but that the balance that we've struck on accountability versus autonomy seems off. I think there's a place to look for unions, especially as I think the discourse around unions has shifted. In 2010, we saw one real shift where it went real negative towards unions, and I think that's turning around. And I think that that's potentially an opportunity for unions to play a role in expanding the status of the profession. Some of the like coalition building activities that the unions do to sort of like organize parents and other groups as well could sort of help to build a political coalition that might be more pro-public or more pro-teacher, public or private. And then school safety, again, I think that the school shootings in particular, even if that's not the major cause, I don't think that's the massive increase in school shootings is helping improve the status of the profession. So yeah, as I mentioned, this is published in American Educational Research Journal. It's a very long paper. They already had a long page limit, and they let us go even over the page limit. So there's even more in the paper. And there's my contact information, my co-author too. So thank you very much.
Slide with the 9 hypotheses. I'd like to write down.
Here, well, yeah, this one, I actually just have
I wrote them down, but I missed.
So this is just kind of like the this one? Yeah.
1 4.
Let's stop.
This one, yeah.
teacher.
This is just the
Okay.
themes. Yeah, but I wrote them out as like actual hypotheses too. Yeah.
Wow, lots to think about.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Oh, man, a lot to think about. I have a wife that taught for 30 years, and I have a son and daughter-in-law that are teaching now. And it just really resonated with me. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great.
Commercial time, though. Our next speaker will be Elizabeth Jakubowski, in 2 weeks. She's a senior librarian in the New York State Library's manuscripts and special collections. Her topic will be tasting history. I've had some burgers that old too. Exploring historic foodways at the New York State Library is where she's coming from, with a look at how food mirrors New York State culture and economics, as well as history. And after listening to Elizabeth on a recent podcast of a New York Minute in History, I can assure you it'll be an enjoyable romp through recipes, realities, and reminiscing. That's in 2 weeks. Have a safe trip home.
It's the last couple of years. So, which they can actually do. Scheduling time. I think being retired. I would have
All
to
good,
schedule
Scott?
it.
Okay. They were able to allow this